Dr. Adam Carter's horse struggled through the thick August heat as he approached Holloway Plantation, the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks like funeral shrouds in the suffocating Mississippi air. The messenger who had arrived at his Natchez office before dawn had been breathless and incoherent, speaking of children who would not wake, of a household gripped by terror, of Mrs. Holloway's conviction that some malevolent force had descended upon her family. The doctor had treated countless cases of fever, consumption, and the various ailments that plagued the plantation families along the Mississippi River, but something in the messenger's voice had unsettled him in a way he could not quite articulate. As he dismounted in the circular drive before the grand columned mansion, he noticed the unnatural silence that hung over the estate, no children's laughter drifting from the grounds, no sounds of play or mischief, only the oppressive buzz of cicadas and the distant rhythmic chopping of axes from the cotton fields beyond the main house. Mrs. Cordelia Holloway met him at the door, her face ashen beneath her carefully arranged curls, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief until the delicate fabric threatened to tear. She seized his arm with surprising strength for a woman of her refined constitution, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate cascade as she pulled him toward the grand staircase. Her children, all 5 of them, had fallen into a state she could only describe as unnatural slumber, she explained as they climbed. It had been gradual at first, she insisted, so gradual that she and her husband had not recognized it as affliction but rather as improvement in behavior. The children had become so peaceful, so biddable, sleeping through the night without nightmares, napping without resistance, sitting quietly during lessons instead of fidgeting and causing disruption. But in the past week, something had shifted terribly. Now they barely woke at all, and when they did, their eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, their responses slow and dreamlike, as though they existed in some realm between waking and sleeping from which they could not fully emerge. The nursery occupied the entire eastern wing of the second floor, a suite of interconnected rooms painted in soft yellows and greens, furnished with the finest cribs and beds that New Orleans money could purchase. Dr. Carter stepped through the doorway and felt his breath catch in his throat at the scene before him. 5 children lay in their respective beds in the middle of a bright August afternoon, arranged like small corpses in a family tomb. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 2 years, lay completely motionless in her crib, her breathing so shallow that the doctor had to move closer to confirm the slight rise and fall of her chest. In the beds beyond, 4 other children ranging in age up to perhaps 9 years old exhibited the same disturbing stillness. Their skin had a waxy quality in the filtered sunlight that streamed through the gauze curtains, and as Dr. Carter approached the nearest child, a boy of about 6 with dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat, he noticed the bluish tint around the lips that spoke of insufficient respiration. The child's pulse was present but slow, disturbingly slow, and when the doctor lifted the boy's eyelid, he found the pupil constricted to a pinpoint that barely responded to the change in light. In the corner of the room, standing with her back nearly pressed against the papered wall, stood a young Negro woman whom Dr. Carter understood to be the children's nursemaid. She was perhaps 20 years old, slight of build, with skin the color of polished walnut and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. Her name was Celestine, Mrs. Holloway informed him with an edge of hysteria creeping into her voice, and she had been caring for the children since February. The enslaved woman's hands were folded at her waist in an attitude of submission, but her face held an expression that troubled the doctor more than he could immediately understand. It was not the fear he would have expected from a servant whose charges had fallen mysteriously ill, though fear was certainly present in the tightness around her eyes and the rigid set of her shoulders. But beneath the fear lay something else, something that might have been resignation or perhaps a kind of grim satisfaction, and her gaze when it met his held a directness that seemed almost challenging before she lowered her eyes in the expected gesture of deference. Mrs. Holloway continued her frantic explanations, pacing between the beds and wringing her hands, insisting this must be some fever carried on the river air or perhaps a curse placed upon the house by one of the conjure women from the quarters, those practitioners of heathen arts that the mistress was convinced held malevolent power despite her husband's dismissive rationalism. Dr. Carter moved from bed to bed, conducting his examination with growing unease. Each child exhibited the same symptoms, the depressed respiration, the pinpoint pupils, the unnatural torpor from which they could barely be roused. When he shook the oldest boy's shoulder firmly and called his name, the child's eyelids fluttered open with agonizing slowness, his gaze unfocused and dreamy, his mumbled response to the doctor's questions slurred and nonsensical before he drifted back into his unnatural sleep. The room carried a peculiar smell beneath the expected sense of childhood, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to cling to the curtains and bedclothes, almost floral but with an underlying bitterness that tickled the back of the doctor's throat. If you're finding this tale as disturbing as it is compelling, make sure to subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below telling us what historical mysteries and dark stories you'd like us to uncover next. Your engagement helps us bring more of these forgotten horrors to light, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. Dr. Carter's attention was drawn to a small table near the window where a pewter pitcher sat beside several cups, and next to it, a collection of dried flowers arranged in a crude earthenware vase. The flowers were poppies, he realized with a start, their papery petals still holding traces of the distinctive scarlet color despite their desiccated state. His mind began working through possibilities, his medical training cataloging symptoms and their potential causes. The pinpoint pupils, the respiratory depression, the profound sedation, these were signs he had seen before in patients who had been administered excessive laudanum or other opiate preparations. But surely no mother would poison her own children, and the household staff would have no access to such medications without the family's knowledge. His eyes moved back to Celestine, who remained motionless in her corner, and he saw her gaze flick briefly to the dried flowers before returning to the floor. Mrs. Holloway explained through her distress that the children's decline had been so gradual as to be nearly imperceptible at first. 6 months ago, when Celestine had first arrived at the plantation, the nursery had been in a constant state of chaos, the children running wild, fighting amongst themselves, resisting bedtime and lessons, exhausting a succession of nursemaids who had left in frustration. Celestine had been purchased specifically for this role from a broker in Charleston who specialized in domestic servants, and her arrival had seemed like divine providence. Within weeks, the household had transformed. The children became tractable and obedient, sleeping soundly through the night and taking long, peaceful afternoon naps. Their parents had praised Celestine's natural way with children, her soft voice and gentle manner, the hymns she sang that seemed to soothe even the most fractious child into compliance. Mrs. Holloway had boasted to her friends about finally finding a nursemaid who could manage her unruly brood, never questioning why children who had previously resisted sleep at every opportunity now seemed to embrace it with such enthusiasm. The doctor listened to this account while continuing his examination, his concern deepening with each detail. He asked about the children's diet, their activities, any changes in routine or environment. Mrs. Holloway struggled to remember specifics, admitting that she had largely left the nursery's day-to-day management to Celestine, visiting her children for brief periods in the morning and evening but otherwise trusting their care entirely to the enslaved woman who had seemed so capable. The children took their meals in the nursery, she explained, separate from the adult household as was proper. Celestine prepared their breakfast porridge and their evening milk herself in the small preparation room adjacent to the nursery, bringing their midday meal up from the kitchen but often supplementing it with special teas she brewed to settle their stomachs or help them sleep. Dr. Carter turned to address Celestine directly, asking her to describe the children's typical daily routine and any remedies or treatments she had been administering. The young woman's voice when she finally spoke was so soft he had to lean forward to hear her, each word carefully measured and precisely articulated in a way that suggested she had taught herself to speak with educated diction despite her enslaved status. She described a schedule of meals and naps, lessons and quiet play, mentioning that she sometimes gave the children chamomile tea to help them sleep or willow bark tea when they showed signs of fever. Her face remained impassive as she spoke, but the doctor noticed the way her fingers had begun to worry at the fabric of her plain cotton dress, a small tell of agitation that belied her calm exterior. When he asked specifically about the dried poppies, she explained without hesitation that she had gathered them from the meadow at the eastern edge of the plantation property, intending to use them for decoration, as the children had admired their bright color. Something in her tone rang false to Dr. Carter's practiced ear, a flatness that suggested rehearsed explanation rather than spontaneous truth. He made a decision that caused Mrs. Holloway to gasp in protest. He informed Celestine that he needed to examine her personal belongings to determine if she had been administering any substances that might account for the children's condition. The enslaved woman's face finally betrayed genuine emotion, a flash of something between panic and defiance, but she had no power to refuse and could only stand rigid as the doctor moved to the small alcove off the main nursery where she slept on a narrow pallet. Her possessions were pitifully few: a spare dress, a head wrap, a small wooden box containing needles and thread, and a cloth doll so worn its features had nearly been rubbed away. Dr. Carter searched methodically, aware of Mrs. Holloway hovering behind him and of Celestine's absolute stillness as she watched from the doorway. Behind a loose board in the wall, his searching fingers encountered something that did not belong: a small glass vial, no larger than his thumb, stopped with a cork and containing perhaps 2 ounces of dark amber liquid. He drew it out carefully, holding it up to the light streaming through the window. The liquid had the characteristic appearance of a concentrated tincture, and when he carefully removed the cork and held it beneath his nose, the distinctive bittersweet smell of opium confirmed his worst suspicions. The vial was hand-labeled in careful script that he recognized as laudanum, but the concentration seemed far greater than any preparation he would prescribe, and the quantity remaining suggested much more had been used. His blood ran cold as understanding crashed over him like a wave. This young woman had been systematically poisoning the Holloway children, administering opiate tincture in sufficient quantities to keep them in a constant state of narcotic sedation, and she had been doing so for months while their parents remained oblivious to the slow destruction of their children's health and vitality. The silence in the nursery stretched taut as a wire as Dr. Carter turned to face Celestine, the vial held between his fingers like an accusation. Her dark eyes met his without flinching, and in that moment he saw something that would haunt him for years to come: not shame, not fear of punishment, but a kind of weary acknowledgement, as though she had been waiting for this discovery and was almost relieved that the waiting had ended. Mrs. Holloway's scream when she understood what the doctor had found shattered the oppressive quiet, and within moments the house erupted into chaos as servants were summoned and Mr. Holloway came thundering up from his study. But through it all, Celestine remained motionless, her expression settling back into that unsettling mask of resignation and something that might have been grim purpose, while behind her the 5 Holloway children lay trapped in their poppy-induced twilight, their shallow breaths marking time like a clock counting down towards some terrible reckoning that had only just begun to unfold. The discovery of the vial transformed Holloway Plantation from a place of genteel southern order into something resembling a prison under siege. Mr. Thaddeus Holloway, a man whose wealth from cotton and river trade had purchased him respect throughout Natchez society, stood in his own nursery with his hands trembling and his face flushed scarlet with a rage so profound he could barely form coherent words. His wife had collapsed onto a settee in the hallway, being attended by the housekeeper with smelling salts and whispered reassurances, while downstairs the household staff moved through their duties in hushed trepidation, aware that something catastrophic had occurred in the family's private quarters. Celestine had been seized by 2 male house servants and locked in a small storage room adjacent to the kitchen, her wrists bound with rope, while Dr. Carter worked frantically to assess whether the children could be safely roused from their opiate stupor or whether sudden withdrawal might prove as dangerous as the poisoning itself. The physician's orders were absolute: no one was to give the children anything to eat or drink without his explicit approval, and Celestine was to be guarded constantly until he could determine the full extent of what she had done and whether the damage could be reversed. As Dr. Carter kept vigil over the 5 small patients through that endless afternoon and into evening, dosing them with weak coffee and cool water in careful increments while monitoring their vital signs with meticulous attention, the household began piecing together the history of the woman who had committed this unthinkable act. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt who had served the Holloway family for 15 years, sat with the doctor in the nursery and recounted what little she knew of Celestine's background. The girl had arrived in February, purchased through a broker who specialized in domestic servants, brought up from South Carolina where she had worked on the Ashford plantation near Charleston. The broker's papers had described her as docile, clean, and experienced with children, having served as a field hand until the overseer had noticed her gentle manner with the slave quarters children and reassigned her to lighter duty. Mrs. Pruitt admitted with something like shame that she had not inquired deeply into Celestine's history. Enslaved people arrived and departed from the household with some regularity, and it had not seemed necessary to know more than that she could perform her duties adequately. But there had been signs, Mrs. Pruitt now realized with the bitter clarity of hindsight, small peculiarities in Celestine's behavior that had seemed merely eccentric at the time but now took on sinister significance. The young woman had been almost obsessively particular about preparing the children's food and drink herself, never allowing the kitchen staff to send up their evening milk without her supervision. She had insisted on brewing special teas for the children, claiming they helped with digestion and promoted restful sleep, and the household had accepted this as evidence of her dedication rather than questioning what herbs she might be steeping. The children had become deeply attached to her within weeks of her arrival, clinging to her skirts and crying when she left the room, but this too had seemed natural for young children bonding with a caring nursemaid. Now Mrs. Pruitt wondered whether that attachment had been the result of physical dependency rather than affection, whether the children had unconsciously recognized that Celestine controlled their access to the substance their bodies had learned to crave. Dr. Carter made a decision that Mr. Holloway initially resisted with outraged protests. He insisted on speaking with Celestine privately to determine exactly what she had been administering, in what quantities, and for how long. The children's survival might depend on understanding the precise nature and extent of their opiate exposure, and only Celestine possessed that knowledge. The doctor descended to the storage room where she was held, finding her sitting on the bare floor with her bound hands resting in her lap, her face illuminated by the single candle that had been left to light the windowless space. When he entered, she looked up at him with those unsettlingly direct eyes, and he saw in them something he had not expected, a kind of fierce intelligence that had been carefully hidden beneath the mask of submissive servitude she had worn in the nursery. He explained that he was not there to judge or punish but to understand, that the children's lives might depend on her cooperation, and after a long moment of silence, she began to speak in that same soft, precise voice, telling him a story that would shake his understanding of morality and mercy to its foundations. Celestine had been born on the Ashford plantation in South Carolina, she told him, the youngest of 4 children belonging to a woman who worked the rice fields from dawn until darkness. Her mother had possessed knowledge of healing herbs passed down from her own mother who had been brought across the ocean from a place she described only as home, and she had taught Celestine which plants could ease pain, reduce fever, or bring sleep. 2 of Celestine's siblings had been sold when she was 7 years old, taken away in a trader's wagon while she and her remaining brother watched from the quarters, understanding even at that young age that they would never see their family whole again. Her brother had drowned 3 years later in one of the plantation's rice paddies, though Celestine's voice when she spoke of this carried an edge that suggested drowning might not have been the full truth of his death. She had been 14 when the overseer had pulled her from field work to mind the white children of the plantation, a duty she had performed with apparent competence for 6 years before being sold to the broker who brought her to Mississippi. But what Dr. Carter had not known, what the purchase papers had not mentioned, was that Celestine had served in 2 other households between South Carolina and Holloway Plantation, and in both places, the children under her care had exhibited the same peculiar symptoms, increasing lethargy, unusual docility, a tendency toward deep sleep that had concerned the parents enough to seek medical attention but never enough to connect the affliction with their trusted nursemaid. In the first household, a family named Merrick who lived outside Savannah, the physician had diagnosed the children with swamp fever and recommended a change of air, prompting the family to send the children to relatives in the mountains for the summer. Celestine had been sold to another household during their absence, her services no longer needed. In the second household, the Brennan family of Mobile, similar symptoms had been attributed to dietary deficiency, and when Celestine had been moved along after 6 months to make room for a more experienced governess, the children's health had mysteriously improved. The pattern was clear now to Dr. Carter's horrified understanding, and he asked the question that burned in his throat like acid, why? Why would she systematically poison children placed in her care, innocent children who had shown her nothing but trust and affection? Celestine's answer came after a long silence, her voice dropping even lower so that the doctor had to lean close to hear her words. She said she had begun with the Merrick children out of something she could only describe as mercy, a desire to give them the gift of peaceful sleep and freedom from the small cruelties that she had learned were inevitable parts of childhood in plantation households. She had watched enslaved children in the quarters sleep restlessly, jerking awake at every sound because they never knew when the overseer might come, when their parents might be taken for punishment, when their own small bodies might be deemed old enough for field work or other uses too terrible to name. But the white children slept peacefully in their soft beds, protected by their parents' power and wealth, and yet still they had nightmares, still they cried in the night, still they woke anxious and afraid of things that seemed trivial compared to the terrors that haunted enslaved children's dreams. If you're still with us through this disturbing journey into history's darkest corners, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this complex and troubling story. Your support allows us to continue exploring these difficult but important historical narratives, so hit that subscribe button and let us know what you think in the comments below. So Celestine had begun giving them small doses of poppy extract, just enough to ease them into deeper sleep, to give them the peace she had never known, and she had found satisfaction in their grateful dependence, in the way their parents praised her for the children's improved behavior. But somewhere between the second household and her arrival at Holloway Plantation, something had shifted in her motivations, she admitted with a frankness that chilled Dr. Carter to his core. The act of administering the tincture had become less about mercy and more about power, about possessing control over the master's children in a way that reversed the fundamental order of the world she inhabited. She had watched Mrs. Holloway fret over her children's increasing lethargy with the same helpless anxiety that enslaved mothers felt watching their children sicken or suffer, and in that mirroring of powerlessness, Celestine had found something that felt like justice, however twisted and dark. Dr. Carter listened with growing horror as Celestine described her methods with clinical precision, how she had learned to calculate dosages based on each child's weight, how she had gradually increased the amounts to build tolerance and deepen dependency, how she had disguised the bitter taste with honey and milk, and how she had carefully monitored the children to ensure they remained in that twilight state between waking and sleeping without crossing into the realm of overdose and death. She had kept no written records, trusting her memory and observation, adjusting quantities based on subtle signs that only someone with her knowledge and attention could detect. The dried poppies in the nursery had indeed been gathered from the meadow at the edge of the plantation, and she had processed them using the methods her grandmother had taught her mother, methods passed down through generations of women who had learned to transmute plants into medicine or poison depending on need and circumstance. The doctor asked whether she had intended to kill the children, and Celestine's answer came with that same unsettling directness. Not at first, she said, but perhaps eventually. She had not yet decided when he arrived to examine them. She explained that part of her had wanted simply to maintain the children in their dependent state indefinitely, keeping them perpetually drowsy and docile as a kind of living testament to her hidden power. But another part of her, the part that remembered her drowned brother and sold siblings, the part that had accumulated years of witnessed cruelties and swallowed rage, had begun contemplating a final act that would make her actions unmistakable and her statement clear, even if she could never speak it aloud. Dr. Carter left that storage room with his hands shaking and his mind reeling, carrying knowledge that he did not know how to reconcile with his understanding of human nature, evil, and the peculiar institution that had created this situation and all its moral complexities. Dr. Carter spent the following day in a state of exhausted vigilance, moving between the nursery where the Holloway children struggled through the early stages of withdrawal and his study where he began composing urgent letters to medical colleagues throughout the South. The children's suffering was acute and pitiable. They writhed in their beds with tremors that shook their small frames, their faces sheened with fevered sweat despite the compresses applied by Mrs. Pruitt and the other household staff who had been pressed into nursing duty. The youngest, little Temperance, cried with a thin, reedy wail that seemed to drill into the doctor's skull, while the oldest boy, Nathaniel, vomited repeatedly into a basin and begged in his delirium for water that tasted sweet, his body screaming for the substance it had learned to crave. Dr. Carter administered what comfort he could, small doses of diluted wine to ease the worst of the tremors, cool cloths for their fevers, constant reassurance that the sickness would pass, but he knew with grim certainty that the road ahead would be long and the outcome uncertain. As he sat in his study that evening, composing inquiries to physicians in Savannah and Mobile, a pattern began emerging that turned his blood cold. He had mentioned in his letters the name Celestine and the symptoms he had observed, asking in carefully worded language whether his colleagues had encountered similar cases in their practices. The response from Dr. Harrison Wellesley in Savannah arrived within 4 days by express post, and its contents confirmed Dr. Carter's darkest suspicions. Dr. Wellesley remembered the case well. The Merrick family had consulted him in the spring of 1856 regarding their 3 children who had fallen into a peculiar lassitude that resisted all conventional treatments. The children had exhibited precisely the symptoms Dr. Carter described, pinpoint pupils, depressed respiration, excessive drowsiness that progressed over weeks from unusual compliance to alarming torpor. Dr. Wellesley had diagnosed swamp fever complicated by the miasmic conditions common to the Georgia coastal region, and had recommended the family send the children to mountain air for recovery, advice they had followed with apparent success. What Dr. Wellesley added to his medical recollection sent a chill through Dr. Carter's chest. He remembered that the Merrick children had been attended by a young enslaved nursemaid whose name he believed was Celestine, though he could not swear to it with certainty. The girl had been present during his examinations, standing quiet and deferential in the corner of the nursery, answering his questions about the children's diet and routine with soft-spoken precision. He recalled thinking at the time that she seemed unusually devoted to her charges, brewing special teas to settle their stomachs and singing hymns that seemed to soothe them even in their illness. The family had sold her shortly after the children departed for the mountains, Dr. Wellesley believed, though he could not say with certainty where she had been sent. The physician's letter concluded with an observation that made Dr. Carter's hand tremble as he read it. Dr. Wellesley noted that he had seen one other case in his career with similar symptomatology, a child in Charleston whose nursemaid had been dismissed after the family physician suspected she was administering laudanum without authorization, though nothing had been proven and the matter had been quietly resolved to avoid scandal. The letter from Dr. Marcus Brennan in Mobile arrived 2 days later and completed the horrifying picture. Dr. Brennan's response was longer and more detailed, written in the careful prose of a man who had spent considerable time contemplating a medical mystery that had troubled his conscience. In the autumn of 1856, he explained, his own brother's family had engaged a nursemaid named Celestine who came with excellent references from a broker specializing in domestic servants. The Brennan children, 2 boys and a girl ranging in age from 3 to 8, had thrived under her care initially, becoming remarkably well-behaved and sleeping soundly through nights that had previously been marked by the typical disruptions of childhood. But gradually, over the course of 4 months, the children had become increasingly lethargic, showing little interest in play or lessons, preferring to lie quietly in their beds or sit motionless by the window, their responses to questions sluggish and their eyes carrying a glazed quality that troubled their mother. Dr. Marcus Brennan had examined the children multiple times, noting the constellation of symptoms that he had attributed to some nutritional deficiency, perhaps a lack of sufficient iron or fresh vegetables in their diet. He had prescribed cod liver oil and fresh fruit, recommendations that seemed to help marginally but never fully resolved the underlying condition. The mystery had solved itself, in a sense, when the family had decided to engage a more experienced governess to oversee the children's education, and Celestine had been sold to a trader bound for Mississippi. Within 3 weeks of her departure, the Brennan children had undergone a remarkable transformation, their energy returned, their eyes brightened, their appetites improved, and they resumed the normal boisterous behavior expected of healthy children. Dr. Brennan had found the recovery puzzling at the time but had attributed it to the changing of seasons and perhaps the beneficial effects of his prescribed treatment finally taking hold. Now, reading Dr. Carter's letter, he understood with horrified clarity what had actually occurred in his brother's household. But Dr. Brennan's letter contained additional information that elevated the horror to an even more disturbing level. After receiving Dr. Carter's inquiry, he had taken it upon himself to investigate further, visiting his brother's household and questioning the servants about Celestine's habits and behaviors during her time in their employ. What emerged from these conversations was a portrait of a young woman who had operated with extraordinary calculation and care, never allowing anyone else to prepare the children's evening milk or their afternoon tea, insisting that she alone knew how to brew the special chamomile blend that helped them sleep. The cook remembered that Celestine had kept a small collection of dried flowers in the nursery, claiming they were for decoration and pleasant scent, and had sometimes requested honey to sweeten the children's drinks, saying they complained of bitter tastes. One of the housemaids recalled seeing Celestine returning from walks in the meadow behind the property carrying bunches of red flowers that she said she was gathering for the children to draw and paint. Most chilling of all, Dr. Brennan had managed to track down the broker who had sold Celestine to his brother's family, and through careful questioning had learned that she had been in at least one previous placement before the Merrick household, a family in Charleston whose name the broker could not immediately recall but who had let her go after less than 4 months of service for reasons the broker described vaguely as a poor fit with the household's needs. The broker had not considered this brief placement worth mentioning in his sales materials, he explained, as brief turnovers were not uncommon in the domestic servant trade and he had no reason to suspect any serious misconduct. Dr. Brennan concluded his letter with a question that haunted Dr. Carter as he sat in his darkening study: how many other households might Celestine have passed through, leaving behind children whose unexplained illnesses had been attributed to fever or dietary deficiency or simple childhood malaise, their parents never suspecting that the trusted nursemaid who sang them to sleep was slowly poisoning them with poppy extract administered in doses calibrated with the precision of a trained apothecary? Dr. Carter descended to the storage room where Celestine remained confined, carrying with him the letters from his colleagues and a determination to understand the full scope of what she had done. She sat in the same position he had found her in days before, her bound hands resting in her lap, her face composed into that mask of resignation that seemed to have settled permanently over her features. He read her portions of the letters, describing the Merrick children's symptoms and recovery, the Brennan children's mysterious illness and subsequent improvement, and he asked her directly how many households she had poisoned, how many children had fallen victim to her calculated administration of opiate tincture. Her answer came without hesitation or apparent remorse. She could not say exactly, she told him, as some placements had been very brief and she had not always had time to establish the full pattern she had perfected with the Holloway children. Perhaps 6 or 7 families in total, she estimated, spanning the 4 years since she had first been assigned to childcare duties in South Carolina. The doctor pressed further, asking whether she understood the magnitude of harm she had caused, the children whose development had been stunted, whose bodies had been made dependent on a substance that could destroy them. Celestine's response demonstrated that same unsettling intelligence he had observed before. She understood perfectly, she told him, and she had kept meticulous mental records of each child's response to the treatments, adjusting dosages with careful attention to avoid permanent damage or death, at least until she had decided otherwise. She described watching for signs of respiratory distress, monitoring the children's color and pulse, pulling back when they approached dangerous thresholds and then resuming once their tolerance had adjusted. She had taught herself to read the language of the body with a precision that would have made her an excellent physician had she been born into circumstances that permitted such aspirations, and she had applied that knowledge to a purpose that inverted the healer's calling into something dark and deliberate. What disturbed Dr. Carter most profoundly was Celestine's explanation of her methodology. She had begun each placement with small doses, just enough to make the children slightly drowsy and more tractable, gradually increasing the amounts over weeks and months as their bodies adapted and required more of the substance to achieve the same effects. She had created what physicians would later come to call addiction, a physical dependency that transformed the children into unwitting prisoners of her hidden ministrations. The hymns she sang to them as they drifted into their drugged sleep were the same hymns that had been sung at her siblings' burials, she told him with that same flat effect, songs of rest and peace and deliverance that took on macabre significance when understood in this context. She had kept hidden among her possessions the small cloth doll made from scraps of fabric, the only remaining connection to her youngest sister who had been sold at age 6 and whose fate remained unknown, and sometimes she had whispered to the doll while the Holloway children slept, telling it that she was making the master's children sleep the way enslaved children could never sleep, without peace or safety or assurance of tomorrow. Dr. Carter left that interview with a profound sense of moral vertigo, understanding that he had encountered something that defied his categories of evil and innocence, a situation where the structure of slavery itself had created the conditions for this horror and made it almost inevitable that such twisted expressions of resistance and revenge would eventually emerge from the depths of human suffering pushed beyond endurance. The Holloway household existed in a state of suspended crisis as the children's withdrawal continued through its second week, their small bodies racked with symptoms that grew worse before they began their agonizingly slow improvement. Mr. Holloway had sent word to the county sheriff, a man named Dalton Briggs who had served in that capacity for 12 years and who arrived at the plantation with the weary demeanor of someone who had witnessed every variety of human transgression the Mississippi Delta could produce. Sheriff Briggs listened to the account of Celestine's crimes with his weathered face set in grim lines, occasionally interjecting questions about evidence and timelines, and when the recitation concluded he announced his intention to transport Celestine to the county jail to await trial for attempted murder. But Dr. Carter objected with an urgency that surprised even himself, explaining that the children's survival depended on managing their withdrawal with careful precision, and only Celestine possessed the knowledge of exactly what she had administered, in what concentrations, and for how long. The physician insisted that she remain at the plantation under guard until the children had safely passed through the worst of their ordeal, and after considerable argument, Sheriff Briggs reluctantly agreed to this arrangement on the condition that armed men would watch her constantly. So Celestine was moved from the storage room to the cellar beneath the main house, a space typically used for storing preserves and root vegetables but which could be secured with a heavy door and iron lock. The cellar was damp and cool even in August, its brick walls beaded with moisture and its packed earth floor releasing the musty smell of underground places. A single lamp provided illumination, and Celestine sat on a wooden crate with her hands still bound, her ankles now shackled with iron cuffs connected by a short length of chain that allowed her to shuffle a few steps but prevented any attempt at flight. Dr. Carter visited her there twice daily to extract information about dosages and to monitor the children's progress against her clinical descriptions of what to expect at each stage of withdrawal. She answered his questions with the same methodical precision, describing symptoms and timelines as though reading from a medical text, her voice never wavering, her eyes meeting his with that unsettling directness that seemed to acknowledge no shame or regret. But it was Mrs. Cordelia Holloway who precipitated the true confrontation, the moment when the full weight of Celestine's actions and motivations would be laid bare in a way that would haunt all present for the remainder of their lives. On the 9th night after the discovery, when the household had finally settled into exhausted sleep and even Dr. Carter had retired to the guest room after 20 hours of continuous vigil, Mrs. Holloway descended the cellar stairs alone, carrying a single candle and moving with the eerie calm of someone who had passed beyond hysteria into a realm of cold clarity. She had dismissed the guard with an imperious command that brooked no argument, telling him she required privacy to speak with the woman who had poisoned her children, and the man had retreated to the kitchen with obvious relief at being excused from witnessing whatever would unfold in that underground space. Mrs. Holloway stood before Celestine in her silk dressing gown and embroidered slippers, her carefully arranged curls unpinned and hanging loose around her shoulders, her face pale but composed, and she asked the question that had been consuming her since the vial had been discovered: why? The two women regarded each other in the flickering lamplight, mistress and enslaved woman, mother and poisoner, their positions in the social hierarchy absolute and unbridgeable except for this singular moment when desperation had driven Mrs. Holloway to seek understanding from someone who should have been beneath her notice as a thinking, feeling human being. Celestine's response began with that same soft voice, but as she spoke, something shifted in her tone, a dropping of pretense that allowed the intelligence and will she had kept carefully hidden to emerge fully into the open. She told Mrs. Holloway that she had begun with mercy, with a desire to give the children the gift of peaceful sleep, to spare them the nightmares and anxieties that even privileged children experience despite their protected lives. But she admitted with a frankness that made the plantation mistress recoil that the act had transformed over time into something darker and more deliberate, a way to reclaim power in a life where she possessed none, to make the master's children dependent on her in a way that inverted the fundamental order of their world. Celestine described watching Mrs. Holloway fret over her children's increasing lethargy with the same helpless anxiety that enslaved mothers felt when their children sickened or suffered or disappeared into the maw of sale and separation. She spoke of her own mother standing in the quarters weeping silently as two of her children were loaded into a trader's wagon, forbidden even to embrace them in farewell because the overseer considered such displays disruptive to plantation efficiency. She described her brother, just 10 years old, found floating face down in a rice paddy after he had been beaten by the overseer for moving too slowly, his death ruled an accidental drowning though his back bore the marks of a whip and everyone in the quarters knew he had been able to swim since he was 5 years old. She told of being pulled from field work at 14 and assigned to mind the plantation owner's children, watching them play with toys that cost more than her mother's entire worth as human property, listening to them complain about trivial discomforts while children in the quarters went hungry and cold. Mrs. Holloway listened with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but Celestine continued without mercy, her voice growing stronger as she described the satisfaction she had found in watching the mistress experience a fraction of the powerlessness that defined enslaved existence. She explained that she had studied each child carefully, learning their individual tolerances and responses, adjusting dosages with the precision of an apothecary because she wanted them to remain alive, at least initially, wanted them to exist in that twilight state where they were present but absent, their bodies occupying space but their spirits trapped in a drowsy realm between waking and sleeping. She had found pleasure in the parents' gratitude when they praised her for the children's improved behavior, knowing that their appreciation was for the very act that was slowly destroying their children's vitality and health. And she admitted that as months passed at Holloway Plantation, she had begun contemplating a final act, a culmination of her hidden rebellion that would involve administering a dose calculated not to sedate but to end, to make her statement unmistakable even if she could never speak it aloud. The confession that followed was delivered in a tone so matter-of-fact it seemed almost more disturbing than if Celestine had raged or wept. She told Mrs. Holloway that she had been planning to increase the dosages gradually over the course of another month, pushing the children's systems to the breaking point, and then one night to administer a final preparation strong enough to stop their breathing while they slept. She would have made it appear as though they had succumbed to the mysterious illness that had plagued them for months, and in the chaos and grief that followed, she had planned to disappear, to slip away in the night and make her way north using the network of sympathetic souls that she had heard whispered about in the quarters, people who helped those seeking freedom reach states where slavery did not exist. She had been 3 days away from enacting this plan when Dr. Carter arrived, she said, 3 days from an act that would have destroyed the Holloway family as completely as slavery had destroyed hers. Mrs. Holloway's legs gave way and she sank onto the cellar floor, her silk gown pooling around her in the dirt, her breath coming in short gasps as she processed what she had just heard. She asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether Celestine felt any remorse, any recognition of the innocence of the children who had been her victims, children who had never personally harmed her and who could not be held accountable for the system into which they had been born. Celestine's answer came after a long silence, and when she finally spoke, her words carried a complexity that would trouble Mrs. Holloway's conscience for the rest of her life. She said she felt something that might be remorse for the children themselves, who were indeed innocent in the sense that they had not chosen their circumstances any more than she had chosen hers. But she felt no remorse for making their parents experience fear and helplessness, for forcing them to watch their children suffer while possessing no power to prevent it, for creating a situation where the mistress had to beg an enslaved woman for information that might save her children's lives. The moral horror of the situation crystallized in that cellar, 2 women facing each other across an abyss of experience and understanding that the institution of slavery had created and maintained. Mrs. Holloway asked what she wanted, what could possibly make this right, and Celestine laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. She told the mistress that nothing could make it right, that the very question revealed how little Mrs. Holloway understood about the world that enslaved people inhabited. She explained that she had not acted seeking any particular outcome or compensation, that her actions had been both more and less than simple revenge, existing in some space where mercy and cruelty became indistinguishable because the structure that contained them was itself fundamentally cruel and morally incoherent. She had made the master's children dependent on her, she said, in the same way that enslaved people were made dependent on masters who held power over every aspect of their existence including their lives and deaths and the lives and deaths of everyone they loved. Mrs. Holloway fled the cellar in tears, stumbling up the stairs and collapsing in the hallway where her husband found her in the early morning hours, incoherent and trembling. She would never speak publicly of what had passed between her and Celestine in that underground space, but those who knew her well would notice the change that settled over her afterward, a new quietness in her manner, a tendency to stare at nothing for long minutes, and a peculiar reluctance to attend the social gatherings where plantation families gathered to discuss crops and politics and the management of their human property. Dr. Carter, when he learned of the midnight confrontation, felt a deep unease about the moral implications of keeping Celestine at the plantation even under guard, but the children's continued struggles through withdrawal left him no choice but to continue extracting information from her about dosages and expected symptoms and the timeline for recovery. Before we continue with the final resolution of this disturbing tale, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. This story raises profound questions about justice, mercy, and the systems that create unthinkable acts. We'd love to hear your perspective on this complex and troubling piece of history. The days that followed saw the children slowly, painfully improving, their bodies gradually releasing their grip on the substance that had controlled them for months. But the household had been forever altered by the revelation of what had occurred in the nursery, and the question of what justice could possibly look like in a situation this morally complex remained unresolved, hanging over Holloway Plantation like the heavy summer air, oppressive and inescapable. The third week of the children's withdrawal brought a transformation in their condition that was both hopeful and deeply troubling to Dr. Carter's practiced medical eye. The acute symptoms had begun to abate, the violent tremors had subsided to occasional shaking, the fever had broken, and the constant vomiting had reduced to intermittent bouts of nausea that could be managed with small sips of ginger tea and dry toast. But what emerged as the opiate fog lifted from their systems was more disturbing in its own way than the physical suffering had been. The children exhibited a profound listlessness that went beyond normal illness recovery, lying in their beds and staring at the ceiling with expressions of such abject misery that the nursing staff found themselves fighting tears as they tended to them. Little Temperance, the youngest at just 2 years old, had developed a habit of rocking herself compulsively, her small body swaying back and forth in her crib while she hummed tunelessly, and no amount of soothing could coax her to stop. Nathaniel, the eldest boy at 9 years, suffered vivid nightmares that had him screaming awake multiple times each night, crying out for something he could not name, his hands grasping at empty air as though reaching for a comfort that had been taken from him. Dr. Carter faced an ethical nightmare that his medical training had not prepared him to navigate. The children's recovery required continued careful management, a gradual tapering of their exposure to opiates rather than complete and immediate cessation, which meant administering small doses of laudanum under controlled conditions to prevent the seizures and cardiac distress that could result from too rapid withdrawal. But determining the appropriate dosages required information that only Celestine possessed, the exact concentrations she had been using, the frequency of administration, the individual tolerances she had observed in each child over months of careful observation. The doctor found himself in the grotesque position of being dependent on the would-be murderer for the information necessary to save her victims, and the moral implications of this dependency ate at his conscience like acid. Each time he descended to the cellar to question Celestine about dosing protocols and symptom management, he felt himself becoming complicit in a system that reduced human beings to property while simultaneously requiring him to treat that human property as a source of essential medical expertise. The household staff engaged in their own moral reckonings as they watched the children's suffering and contemplated Celestine's fate. The overseer, a brutal man named Garrett Sims who had served Holloway Plantation for 8 years, argued vociferously for immediate execution without the formality of trial. He insisted that allowing Celestine to continue breathing while the children she had poisoned struggled through withdrawal sent a dangerous message to the other enslaved people on the plantation, suggesting that such acts might be tolerated or that white authority could be challenged with impunity. Mr. Holloway initially seemed inclined toward this view, his rage at what had been done to his children making him receptive to swift and violent retribution. But Dr. Carter's medical authority and Mrs. Holloway's strange quietness after her midnight encounter in the cellar created a counterweight that prevented immediate action, forcing a delay that became its own form of torture as the household existed in a state of suspended judgment. Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, found herself troubled by questions she had never before allowed herself to contemplate. She had served in plantation households her entire adult life, managing domestic staff and maintaining the orderly functioning of white families' private spaces, and she had always considered herself fair and reasonable in her treatment of the enslaved people under her supervision. But watching Celestine's methodical destruction of the Holloway children, and understanding the calculated intelligence required to perpetrate such an act over months without detection, forced Mrs. Pruitt to confront uncomfortable questions about what other thoughts and plans might lurk behind the subservient expressions of the people she supervised daily. She found herself viewing the enslaved women who worked in the house with new suspicion, wondering whether their apparent contentment was genuine or merely another mask concealing resentment and rage that might someday express itself in ways equally terrible. The enslaved people in the quarters engaged in their own whispered conversations about Celestine and her actions, debates that revealed the complexity of their own moral universe in ways that would have surprised and disturbed the white household had they been privy to those discussions. Some condemned her actions as madness that would bring down punishment on the entire enslaved community, arguing that poisoning children could only result in harsher treatment and increased suspicion for everyone. Others saw her as a kind of tragic hero who had struck back against the system in the only way available to someone in her position, even if her methods were extreme and ultimately self-destructive. A few, speaking in the lowest whispers and only to those they trusted completely, admitted to a kind of grim satisfaction in seeing the master's family brought low, forced to experience a fraction of the fear and helplessness that defined enslaved existence. The divisions these debates revealed within the enslaved community demonstrated the way that slavery poisoned not only the relationship between master and enslaved but the relationships among the enslaved themselves, creating moral complexities that had no clear resolution. Dr. Carter's interactions with Celestine during this period took on an increasingly surreal quality. She responded to his medical questions with continued precision, describing the progression of withdrawal symptoms he should expect and the circumstances under which he should administer small controlled doses versus allowing the children's systems to process the detoxification without chemical assistance. But she also began speaking to him about matters beyond immediate medical necessity, sharing observations about the nature of slavery and power that the doctor found himself unable to dismiss despite their source. She told him that the peculiar institution, as its defenders euphemistically called it, created situations where all human relationships became fundamentally distorted and poisonous, where the exercise of absolute power over other human beings corrupted the powerful while the experience of absolute powerlessness drove the enslaved to expressions of resistance that ranged from subtle sabotage to outright violence. She explained that her actions existed on a spectrum that included many other forms of resistance: the cook who oversalted the master's food or allowed meals to burn, the field hand who worked slowly enough to avoid punishment but never efficiently enough to maximize profit, the house servant who broke expensive items and claimed accident, the wet nurse who sang songs of freedom to the white infants at her breast. The doctor listened to these philosophical discourses with growing discomfort, recognizing the intelligence and moral reasoning in Celestine's arguments even as he recoiled from the conclusions they supported. She told him that mercy and cruelty became impossible to distinguish in a system built on the premise that some human beings could be owned by others, that her administration of poppy extract to give children peaceful sleep existed on a continuum with the entire structure of plantation life where enslaved children were separated from parents, where women were forced to bear children who would be sold away, where men were worked until their bodies broke and then discarded like worn-out tools. She asked him whether it was more cruel to slowly poison children with opium or to raise them in a system where their humanity was constructed around the dehumanization of others, where their comfort and privilege depended on the absolute subjugation of people who looked after them and raised them and sometimes loved them despite having no choice in the matter. Mr. Holloway, confronted with the need to make a decision about Celestine's fate, found himself trapped by considerations that went beyond simple justice or revenge. The economic reality could not be ignored. Celestine represented a significant financial investment, approximately $1,200 paid to the broker who had sold her to the plantation. Executing her meant absorbing that loss, a not insignificant amount even for a family of Holloway's means. But beyond the financial calculation lay the more troubling question of reputation and social standing. If the full story of what had occurred in the Holloway nursery became public knowledge, if it became known that an enslaved woman had been systematically poisoning the family's children for months without detection, the social consequences could be devastating. The Holloway children, particularly the daughters, would become objects of gossip and speculation, their marriage prospects potentially damaged by the taint of scandal. Questions would be raised about Mr. Holloway's competence as master of his household, his ability to maintain proper control over his enslaved property, his fitness as a patriarch who had failed in the fundamental duty of protecting his own children. Sheriff Briggs, when consulted about the legal options, explained that a trial would require testimony and evidence that would inevitably become part of the public record, available for newspaper reporters and gossips to disseminate throughout the county and beyond. The alternative, summary execution without trial, was legally permissible under Mississippi law, which granted slave owners wide latitude in disciplining their property, but even this carried risks of unwanted attention if word spread about the circumstances. The sheriff suggested a third option that was quietly practiced throughout the South when enslaved people created problems that were too scandalous to address through normal legal channels: sale to a trader heading to the Western Territories, specifically to Texas or Arkansas, where the demand for labor was high and questions about an enslaved person's history were rarely asked with much persistence. This solution would remove Celestine from the plantation, eliminate the ongoing reminder of what had occurred, and recover at least a portion of the financial loss her purchase had represented. Dr. Carter objected to this proposal on the grounds that it would allow Celestine to potentially repeat her crimes with another family's children, but Mr. Holloway countered that any trader would be informed that she was being sold for disciplinary reasons and would price her accordingly, and her new owners would presumably be warned to keep her away from children and watch her carefully. The doctor found this reasoning hollow, suspecting that traders and buyers frequently ignored or discounted such warnings, but he possessed no authority to prevent the sale, and his own position at the plantation was becoming increasingly untenable as the household's need for his medical expertise diminished with the children's improving condition. The moral horror of the situation had come down to this: Celestine would be sold away, her attempted murder of 5 children resolved not through any system of justice but through the same mechanism of sale that had created her in the first place, displacing the problem rather than addressing it and ensuring that whatever happened to her afterward would remain unknown and unaccounted for. The children continued their painful recovery, their small bodies slowly relearning how to function without the chemical dependence Celestine had imposed upon them. But Dr. Carter observed with growing dread that the damage might be permanent in ways that went beyond physical health: little Temperance's developmental delays, Nathaniel's addiction to the very substance that had poisoned him, the other children's flattened affect and difficulty engaging with the world around them. He had saved their lives, but he could not say with certainty that he had saved them. 6 weeks after Dr. Carter had discovered the vial hidden in Celestine's quarters, Holloway Plantation had settled into a new rhythm that bore the surface appearance of normalcy while remaining fundamentally altered beneath its carefully maintained facade. The children had survived their withdrawal, though the word "survived" carried connotations of damage and diminishment that haunted everyone who had witnessed their ordeal. Little Temperance, now approaching her 3rd birthday, exhibited developmental delays that Dr. Carter feared would never fully resolve. Her speech remained limited to a handful of words where children her age typically spoke in complete sentences, and she showed little interest in the world around her, preferring to sit quietly with her cloth doll and rock in the repetitive motion that had become her primary comfort. The doctor had gently suggested to Mrs. Holloway that Temperance might always remain somewhat simple, a devastating prognosis delivered in the euphemistic language that Victorian medicine used to describe cognitive impairment. Nathaniel, the eldest at 9 years old, had emerged from the acute withdrawal only to fall into a new affliction that Dr. Carter recognized with sinking dread as the beginnings of addiction proper. The boy suffered from recurring nightmares that left him screaming and drenched in sweat, crying out for something he could not name but which his body remembered with cellular insistence. He complained constantly of pain in his limbs and head, phantom aches that had no physical cause but which drove him to beg for medicine to make them stop. Dr. Carter had initially prescribed small doses of laudanum to ease the worst of these symptoms, but he quickly realized that doing so merely maintained the dependency Celestine had created, and he found himself trapped in an impossible situation where denying the child relief meant condemning him to suffering while providing it meant ensuring his continued enslavement to opiate need. The boy's personality had changed in ways that went beyond physical dependency. Where he had once been boisterous and occasionally defiant, he had become withdrawn and anxious, his eyes holding a haunted quality that made him seem decades older than his years. The 3 middle children, Cordelia Jr. at 7, Monroe at 5, and Dalton at 4, fell somewhere between these extremes, each carrying their own particular scars from the months they had spent in Celestine's care. Cordelia experienced sudden fits of inexplicable weeping that could last for hours, her small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from some deep well of sorrow she could not articulate. Monroe had developed a terror of sleeping alone and would only rest if someone sat beside his bed holding his hand, and even then he slept fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound. Young Dalton seemed the least affected physically but had become almost pathologically attached to his mother, following her from room to room and becoming hysterical if she left his sight for more than a few minutes. Dr. Carter documented these symptoms in his medical journal with clinical precision, but privately he wondered what the long-term implications would be for children who had spent formative months in a state of chemically induced stupor, their development arrested and their natural childhood experiences replaced by endless twilight sleep. The resolution of Celestine's fate had unfolded with the cold efficiency that characterized the business dealings of plantation economy, stripped of any pretense of justice or moral reckoning. Mr. Holloway had ultimately decided that execution would raise too many questions and potentially damage his family's reputation, while keeping Celestine on the plantation was obviously impossible given the horror she had perpetrated under his roof. 3 weeks after Dr. Carter's discovery of the vial, a slave trader named Josiah Crenshaw had arrived at the plantation driving a wagon that already contained 6 other enslaved people being transported to the Texas territories. Crenshaw was a hard-faced man who asked few questions and offered a price of $800 for Celestine, a significant loss from the $1,200 Mr. Holloway had paid but more than he had expected given the circumstances. The transaction had been completed with business-like dispatch, papers signed, money exchanged, and Celestine removed from the cellar where she had spent 6 weeks in chains and loaded into Crenshaw's wagon alongside the other human cargo bound for destinations unknown. Dr. Carter had been present for Celestine's departure, standing on the front portico as the wagon rolled down the Oak Line Drive toward the main road. She had not looked back at the plantation or made any gesture of farewell or defiance, her face composed into that same mask of resignation he had observed since the beginning. Her hands were shackled with iron cuffs, and she sat wedged between 2 other women in the wagon bed, her small cloth doll, the one memento of her murdered siblings that she had been permitted to keep, clutched against her chest. The doctor had experienced a complicated swirl of emotions as he watched her disappear down the road, relief that she would no longer pose a threat to the Holloway children, unease about what might await her in Texas or wherever Crenshaw ultimately sold her, and a lingering sense that nothing had been resolved, that the fundamental horror of what had occurred remained unaddressed and perhaps unaddressable within the moral framework that slavery imposed on all who existed within its bounds. Life at Holloway Plantation had continued because life always continues, indifferent to individual tragedy or moral crisis. The nursery had been thoroughly cleaned and repainted, the walls transformed from pale yellow to a soft blue that Mrs. Holloway believed might prove more calming to the children. New furniture had been purchased from a craftsman in Natchez, the old beds and cribs removed as though fresh wood and fabric could erase the memory of what had transpired in that space. The poppy meadow at the eastern edge of the plantation property had been burned in a controlled fire supervised by the overseer, the earth plowed under and planted with cotton so that the distinctive red flowers would never again bloom there. A new nursemaid had been engaged, a woman named Ruth who was perhaps 50 years old, carefully vetted through multiple references, and who was watched with an obsessive attention that made her own position at the plantation uncomfortable and precarious. But despite these physical transformations, the psychological and spiritual damage could not be so easily remedied. Mrs. Holloway had withdrawn from the social obligations that had once filled her calendar, declining invitations to teas and musicales with excuses about the children's delicate health that were transparent to anyone who knew the family. She spent hours sitting in the nursery watching her children with an expression of profound sadness, as though mourning something that had been lost even though they had survived. Her relationship with her husband had become strained in ways that neither could articulate. Mr. Holloway resented what he perceived as her excessive coddling of children who needed to resume normal life, while she could not forgive him for selling Celestine rather than ensuring she faced some consequence that resembled justice. The unspoken knowledge that they had both been deceived for months by an enslaved woman they had trusted implicitly created a crack in their marriage that would never fully heal. Dr. Carter had returned to his practice in Natchez carrying knowledge that troubled his sleep and complicated his relationship with the other plantation families he served. He found himself viewing the enslaved nursemaids and domestic servants in his patients' households with new suspicion, wondering what thoughts and plans might lurk behind their subservient expressions, what resentments might be building toward expression in ways both subtle and catastrophic. He had written a detailed account of the case for a medical journal, carefully omitting identifying details to protect the Holloway family's privacy, but the editor had declined to publish it with the explanation that the subject matter was too disturbing and might cause unnecessary alarm among families who employed enslaved nurses. The doctor kept the manuscript in a drawer of his desk, occasionally taking it out to read and adding marginal notes about the long-term effects he observed in the Holloway children during his periodic follow-up visits, creating a chronicle of damage that he suspected would extend far beyond childhood into their adult lives. The children's medicine cabinet in the nursery now contained multiple bottles of laudanum prescribed by Dr. Carter for various ailments, Nathaniel's pain and sleep troubles, Temperance's occasional agitation, Monroe's nighttime terrors. The bitter irony was not lost on anyone involved that the children's recovery from poisoning with opiate tincture had resulted in their legitimate medical need for the same substance, creating a dependency that had begun as Celestine's crime but had been transformed through medical authority into acceptable treatment. Mrs. Holloway administered the doses herself with trembling hands, following Dr. Carter's instructions precisely, always aware that she was giving her children the very substance that had nearly destroyed them, unable to reconcile this necessity with her horror at what had been done to them. 5 months after Celestine's sale and departure, Mrs. Holloway was cleaning out a storage cupboard in the nursery when she discovered something that had escaped notice during the thorough purging that had followed the revelation of the poisoning. Behind a loose board in the wall, tucked into a space barely large enough to accommodate it, was Celestine's cloth doll, not the one she had been permitted to take with her, but a second doll that Mrs. Holloway had not known existed. This one was more carefully constructed than the crude toy Celestine had clutched in the wagon, its features more defined, its clothing made from scraps that Mrs. Holloway recognized as having come from the children's outgrown garments. Inside the doll, discovered only when Mrs. Holloway's trembling hands accidentally tore the fabric, was a scrap of paper bearing words written in the careful script of someone who had taught herself to write with painstaking effort. The message was brief, just 7 words that would echo in Mrs. Holloway's mind for the remainder of her life: "I made you sleep so you would not become them." The ambiguity of those words haunted Mrs. Holloway more than any explicit confession or expression of hatred might have. Did them refer to the slaveholding class in general, suggesting that Celestine had viewed her poisoning as a twisted form of mercy, an attempt to spare the children from growing into adults who would perpetuate the system that had destroyed her own family? Or did them refer to something more specific, the particular cruelties she had witnessed or experienced at the hands of previous families' children, suggesting her actions had been preventative rather than punitive? Or was the statement even darker, implying that by keeping the children in perpetual twilight sleep, Celestine had been preventing them from achieving full consciousness and moral agency, denying them the very humanity that slavery denied to enslaved people? Mrs. Holloway would never know, and the uncertainty of Celestine's motivations and meaning proved more disturbing than any definitive answer could have been. The years that followed saw the Holloway children grow into adolescence and eventually adulthood, each carrying the invisible scars of those months under Celestine's care in ways that shaped their personalities and life trajectories. Nathaniel struggled with opiate dependency through his teenage years, eventually dying at age 23 from an overdose of morphine that may or may not have been intentional, his death certificate listing heart failure as the cause, but everyone who knew him understanding the real culprit. Temperance never fully developed beyond the mental capacity of a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, spending her life in quiet docility at her parents' home, never marrying, never expressing much interest in the world beyond her immediate surroundings. The 3 middle children survived into adulthood with varying degrees of functionality. Cordelia Jr. married but remained childless by choice, unable to trust herself with the care of children after what had been done to her. Monroe became a physician, perhaps driven by unconscious need to understand what had happened to him, and Dalton moved to California as soon as he reached his majority, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the plantation where his childhood had been stolen. As for Celestine, her ultimate fate remained unknown, swallowed by the vast machinery of the internal slave trade that moved thousands of human beings across the expanding American South and West each year. Dr. Carter made inquiries through his network of medical colleagues in Texas and Arkansas, asking if anyone had encountered a young Negro woman named Celestine with knowledge of herbal remedies and a history of working as a nursemaid, but no definitive information ever emerged. There were rumors, a woman matching her description who had been sold to a plantation in East Texas where she worked in the fields until she died of fever 3 years later, another story of a woman who had escaped from a trader's coffle and made her way to Mexico, achieving the freedom she had sought, still another tale of a nursemaid in Arkansas who had been hanged after 3 children in her care had died mysteriously in their sleep, though the details were too vague to confirm. Identification. The truth had disappeared into the historical silence that claimed so many enslaved people's stories, their lives and deaths recorded only in sales receipts and estate inventories if they were recorded at all. The Holloway Plantation itself continued operating until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, when the institution that had created Celestine and shaped her actions and ultimately destroyed her and the children she had poisoned began its violent collapse. The plantation house burned during Sherman's march through Mississippi in 1863, destroying whatever physical evidence might have remained of the events that transpired in the nursery during that fateful summer of 1857. Mrs. Holloway died during the war years, exhausted by privation and grief, while Mr. Holloway survived to see emancipation but never recovered financially from the war's devastation, spending his final years in reduced circumstances, haunted by memories of wealth and power that had proved as ephemeral as the morning mist on the Mississippi River. The story of what happened in the Holloway nursery became one of those whispered tales that circulated among certain circles, doctors sharing cautionary cases about the dangers of trusting enslaved nurses without supervision, families passing down warnings about the need for vigilance even with seemingly trustworthy servants, abolitionists citing it as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence on all who existed within its bounds regardless of their position in the hierarchy. But the full complexity of what had occurred, the moral ambiguity that made simple categorization impossible, remained largely unexplored. Celestine was remembered, when she was remembered at all, as either a monster who had poisoned innocent children or a victim driven to desperate measures by an inhuman system, these binary interpretations obscuring the more disturbing truth that she had been both and neither, that her actions existed in a realm where conventional moral categories collapsed under the weight of slavery's foundational evil. The final, most haunting aspect of the entire affair was the question that Dr. Carter continued to wrestle with until his own death in 1879. Had Celestine's actions been an aberration, a single case of individual pathology, or had they been merely the most visible expression of a dynamic that operated constantly beneath the surface of plantation life? How many other enslaved people harbored similar resentments and rage, expressing them in ways too subtle to detect or attribute to deliberate sabotage? How many children had been harmed by nurses who found small ways to retaliate for their own suffering? And most troubling of all, what did it say about the institution of slavery that it created situations where mercy and murder could become indistinguishable, where love and hatred could be expressed through the same acts, where the exercise of care could be simultaneously genuine and poisonous? If you've stayed with us through this dark and complex journey into a forgotten corner of American history, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like Celestine's remind us that history is rarely simple, that the systems we create shape human behavior in ways both predictable and terrifying, and that the legacy of those systems extends far beyond their formal ending. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your perspective on this troubling tale, and join us as we continue exploring the shadowed corners of the past where uncomfortable truths wait to be examined. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.